Well, Galen called this Trinity Talks last week, and I kind of like that, Trinity Talks. I had mentioned, I'll just say it again, a fabulous day this past summer I spent at my sister's cottage in Wood Lake by Bracebridge. Lisa and I haven't hung out together as brother and sister for two days since, I don't know, we were teenagers maybe. You know, you raise your family, you're busy, and she just said, come on up to the cottage. We spent the day, and it was fabulous. We swam, and we read, and we did whatever that we wanted, but I thought of all these years knowing she's been a teacher. She's taught from kindergarten to grade 5. She's been in a small school near Georgetown, and somewhere in the conversation she said, you know, one of the things I do with my kids every year at the first days of school is get them to write me a note. You know, Mrs. B, this is what I'd really like you to know about me. And she does the same for them. And I said, you've got to send me what you've got to send me what you write. And it was just wonderful, because good sense of humor. But, you know, she began it by saying, you may think that I'm a pretty scary teacher. And my kids who have, one daughter anyway, has been in her class and said, my aunt's she really sets the law down. But she's got a great sense of humor, and she goes on to share with the kids how much she really loves teaching, and really how much she likes having a good time, like me. Two of us together are very much fun. And yet she also spoke about the troubling times when she watches bullying happen at school, and she names it quite honestly. Sometimes the bullying are adults, teacher to teacher. So that's where this kind of came from. And last Sunday was wonderful. We were able to share a little bit about ourselves. And we said this week, send us an email. We got several emails. And so some people are going to come forward and sit in a chair. We're just going to have an honest conversation with them. And if you are somebody that just is spontaneous and feels like saying something, the mic is here. You can come forward. We're always open to last-minute surprises. So in terms of Scripture, the thing I wanted to say about this passage, what strikes me profound in Scripture is every time I, at least in my experience, find it to be really authentic and honest. Jesus says, who do you say I am? And what makes it real for me is over and over again, the disciples just don't quite understand Jesus. They don't get it. They get embarrassed by him. They get confused, thinking he's going to be the king of the world. And he keeps surprising them. And to me, that's what life is all about. For me, and life is beautiful, but believe me, there's days I didn't know if I was going to get through the day, and I can go right to that very moment of what that day was about for me. The life is very painful, and Jesus knows that. And so, Jesus 1 minute is looking at Peter, and I'm going to build my church upon the rock, and next minute he's looking at Peter and saying, get behind me, Satan. You don't have a clue what God is all about. And so I think it's a really powerful scripture to get us to ask ourselves, who is this God that we proclaim, we struggle sometimes to believe in? Some days we have great faith, some days, as one friend said, there's a little bit of agnostic in all of us. Sometimes there's an atheist in us at times. So I'm going to invite Noreen to come forward from the choir. She's our first, and Galen, you can stay there. So Noreen, why don't you come forward? And we're going to just ask you a couple questions here. I don't think the mic's on there for you. So thanks for, you sent me an email very quickly. Yep. And I approved it. I said, I was really touched by your email. And so I guess where I wanted to begin with, where did it all begin for you in terms of just, I see you as a person that's been president of Bay Quinte Conference. You've been, you're a church lady. Let's be honest. You're a church lady. You remind me of my mother in a sense. My mom lived and breathed the church. Seems like you. Has that always been your life?
Pretty much. I think I mentioned in my email that my folks didn't go to church, although my father was a very strong believer, but they never attended church. There's a story to that, too. But my oldest sister, dragged me to church. She sort of raised me, in a sense. And I don't know. That's when I found, I never thought of it at the time, that God was working in my life. but I just started going to church, and I was singing in a choir when I was 13 years old. I got myself baptized and confirmed, and it just went on from there.
Is this something that when you were baptized, that you thought well, the Lord had really come into your life? Or is this something your sister saying, do this, Noreen?
No, she didn't say it. I don't know where she was at that time because she wasn't at my baptism.
She dragged you, then she let you go. I think she dragged you to church.
Yeah, she pretty much did. And all I can account for it is that God was working in my life, and that's I didn't know it at the time. I had no idea that was God giving me a little bit of a kick in the butt, as I now say.
Yes. So keep the mic really
Okay,
close.
I'll keep
to
it
your
right
mouth.
here then.
That's
How's
it.
that?
That's right. Thanks, Noreen.
So you said God kind of gave you a little nudge. Well, your words were kick in the butt, but that was, sometimes I think, we're not sure in our life's path why one thing happens or one thing else doesn't happen, and you just had this sense that somehow, looking back, there was a sense of God's presence and something happening. I was thinking of that scripture, now that you'll see things maybe cloudy, but then it'll become clear later.
Yeah, it did, and it pretty much kept up until after I was married, and I was still in the church. I was a CGIT leader and still singing in choirs. We continued on, I continued on in church, and then I don't know, that's when I think, I don't know what started it, but I started looking at other denominations. I had a very devout Catholic sister-in-law, and I was looking everywhere, but somewhere along the way, God said, no, you're staying where you belong, which is the United Church of Canada. And from there, it just grew, because then I was going more to church, becoming more involved. We were going to Rexdale United. I became an elder in the church when they had elders, still singing in choirs, still doing all the things in the church that, I had been doing. It wasn't actually until I moved to Fenelon Falls that things became much more involved.
What was it about Fenelon Falls that changed?
I think it must have been perhaps my minister at the time. She sort of encouraged me in every way to stretch myself. It started, I says, I'd like someday to go to general council. She says, well, Noreen, first thing you have to do is go to presbytery. And, well, there's been a real busy trail since then, from presbytery to conference, to president of conference, to general council 4 times. Wonderful, fantastic experience. But then they had a licensed lay worship leaders study at our church. Presbytery was holding it, but it was at our church. And I said, well, I started taking that, and she just always said, yes, do this, yes.
The cheerleader.
So I started preaching, and I soon found I was preaching every Sunday, and I was very seldom in Fenelon Falls United Church. Because the then Lindsay Presbytery was desperately short of lay preachers, but it just blossomed there, and
you enjoyed that, I sense, sharing
I did.
Sharing your faith from the pulpit?
I felt that, I also learned a great deal about myself and a great deal about God in the preaching. I read unbelievable number of books. I made some drastic changes in my thinking, and I'm sure that was God at work. Like when, in the 1988 decision, I was horrified. By 1996, I was defending the position. So that's how much the change came in my life.
So gay ministers at first was a frightening thought, and it evolved.
And well, I took a look at Leviticus, where all this nonsense comes from, and I printed it out on a dot matrix printer, and I preached on this. And by the time I finished preaching, the one member of our church said to me, if we had heard that sermon in 1988, we would not have lost our congregation.
Wow.
Because I explained in Leviticus, if you want to really know how that you shouldn't be following that passage, just read Leviticus sometime and you'll find out for yourself. Because you wear fabrics together like cotton and nylon and everything else mixed up. I don't see many men out here with a beard on, but in Leviticus you should have a beard. You shouldn't be clean shaven. You should never have a new mother. A matter of fact, you should stay away from her for 40 days. So, you know, that's Leviticus. So you take one piece of thing about homosexuality out of it and make it into a big thing, but ignore the rest.
For my last question, is there something you'd like to share with us about who God is for you today? I mean, you were dragged to church. You went through a lot of the traditions of the church. Who's God for you today?
God for me today is a constant companion. I know now that God is spirit. I don't think of God as an old man with a long white beard. God to me is a constant companion. I always know that God is there with me and never leaves me.
Let's give a little thank you for Noreen to share. It takes a lot of courage to come up here and let us just...
Well, at the hot
This is not
seat.
rehearsed. This is not rehearsed. This is not rehearsed at all. So Cyril, where's Cyril? There you are. Cyril is going to come forward. For those who don't know, Cyril Rose came from Kelowna, been here in Guelph, and Cyril's been an educator most of his life. We've had a lot of fun because we have some Salvation Army Connection friends, and so I'm really glad that you're here with us.
Hi, Kendra. Thank you. I did not email John. John emailed me, which I was happy to receive the email, so no big deal.
Thanks for clarifying that. So Cyril, you've been on quite a journey. You've been in different denominations, and you tell us a little bit about how did faith kind of all start for you, really?
Well, a bit like Noreen, I was born into a Christian home. My mom and dad were very faithful church attenders. My mom had a very, I'd hate to use the word simple because it sounds kind of condescending, but she had a very, how could I put it, very uncomplicated faith. And it was faith. I remember one story. We had a missionary coming to speak at the church and how they needed these funds. And she had her last $5 in her wallet or purse long ago, which was to buy the rest of the groceries for the week. And my aunt was with her, and she said, "Oh, I got to give this money to her." And she said, "Well, you don't have any money. Al doesn't get paid till." "That's all right. God will provide." And she got home that evening, and they were trying to sell this old stove, and the stove sold. And she asked my dad, "Well, when did that sell?" Within 2 minutes of her donating the money and saying, "God will provide." So, you know, it's the kind of story, well, when these things happen, you know, well, it's a coincidence. I always like the words of the former Archbishop of Canterbury, William Temple. Whenever I pray, coincidences happen. and I was always moved by that story. My dad, on the other hand, was very, how can I put it, philosophical about his faith. We were one of the few families in the 50s that didn't have a car, so we walked a lot of the places. And I remember some great conversations with my dad about the church. And he always said, he says, be faithful, be loyal, but don't get caught up in it. He says, because God is actually bigger than the church. And he gave me a wonderful understanding of the nature of God and how not to let people try to define who God is. Come with that personal understanding as much as you can. So much like Noreen, I had a lot of other denominational influences. for many, many years, I'd look for some kind of training, but it wasn't always possible. And then in my adult years, I got the chance to go to Whitworth University, which was a Presbyterian school, and quite different from some of the Salvation Army beliefs. And yet I found it very, very encouraging. I got a deeper understanding of faith, a deeper understanding of the nature of God and the nature of Scripture. So it really has been a journey. It's been almost a pilgrimage. And again, it's exciting in the sense that God is, how can I put it? God's full of surprises sometimes, you know. There have been difficult times, certainly the death of my first wife and having to be a single dad for a few years was a challenge. But again, as my dad always said, just always be aware of the certainty and the constant support and love of God. And I found that at that time. And then a beautiful lady came into my life, Rose, and I got a chance to marry, and we've had some wonderful fellowship. And again, it's that fellowship that kind of brought us into the United Church, I think. I could never, ever badmouth what happened and how I grew up, because there were some wonderful things that we learned. But we also realized that our society's understanding of God was changing. And the group that we always found that was prepared to talk about that and discuss that and share that were our friends in the United Church. And again, when we came to Guelph, we were, at that time, we had just taken, I had quite an interest in the therapeutic touch. And of course, Trinity had that. Unfortunately, we've not been able to be as involved with that as now. But that brought us here. And we would talk with other Christian folks about it, and they were a little worried it might be New Age and all the rest of it. We didn't see that. You know, we saw another way in which God could move in our society, and with another understanding of Him. I better stop because I'll just keep going, John.
You are a natural. Well, let's give thanks to Cyril as well. Thank you so much. That was great. And Joanne Engel, I'm going to ask Joanne to come forward. She sent me nothing overly long, but what she sent me was profound. And I just asked Joanne, I said, would you mind coming forward to say something that was particularly about Scripture? And so thanks, Joanne, for saying yes to talk a little bit. And Joanne, you before coming here in Norfolk, you were in Niagara. You've been chair of Niagara Presbytery. You've preached a lay preaching down in Niagara, like a lot of your church history, a lot of your great times in Niagara.
Very great times. I feel like I was listening to Noreen and I thought, geez, that sounds familiar. I grew up in the United Church, always been here, and I don't know if it's about small congregations that you become so involved, and I was one of those people that loved presbytery. You know, people would almost look at me and say, what kind of woman is this?
You're unique, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah, I did. I chaired presbytery, went to general council, and took lay preachers courses. And I did a lot of things that Noreen did. So, but I was raised in a happy family. Trained, became a nurse, got married, had children, and everything was pretty good.
And church was always part of your life then?
Always part of my life, always. And the older I got, the more involved I got. And
What
then,
about Scripture? When did you started thinking about preaching? When did that start to become, you got to a deeper level? Is there something?
okay, the scripture passage that I chose was, I can do all things with God who strengthens me. And when my children left home, my son went to university, my daughter got married, and my husband left. And I was separated and all by myself. And I had a lot of money problems. I had 2 small part-time jobs, but they certainly didn't pay the bills. And I was scared. I was preaching, and I came across that passage from Philippians. And I also came across, and actually it was in the scripture that I read today, that you are not in the driver's seat. God has to be in the driver's seat. And I thought, I don't know what I'm going to do now. I'm all by myself. And I heard the story of the tandem bike. And our relationship with God is like a tandem bike. And at first, we want to be the steerer. We want to be in control, and we want God to just come along and help us when we needed it. But at that time, I realized I wasn't getting very far. And it was at that time that I had to say, oh God, you be the steerer, and you direct my life, because I'm not doing a very good job here. And that's when suddenly, you know, I had 2 small part-time jobs, but suddenly I would get an extra shift, and that would pay the bill. And I thought, how did that happen? And then I'd be asked to preach somewhere. Well, that would pay another bill. And the more I had faith in just doing what God wanted me to do, the more things worked out. So that's why that scripture passage, and when I read it today, it just said, you're not in the driver's seat. You have to let God be in the driver's seat. Yeah. And so when, you know, I came time to retire, and I knew I had to leave Niagara to get closer to family, and I thought, how can I leave everything familiar? And I thought, it's okay. God's already there. So everything will work out fine.
Oh, thank you so much.
That sense of God being in the driver's seat, I can hear some people saying, well, it's kind of like, well, I'm not going to let go of all that control, or,
Yeah.
I mean, it's a bit of a myth for us to think that we have control in our lives anyway.
But we don't.
Yeah,
Right?
true.
We don't. But
That's
I
right.
almost think of it as having God in the driver's seat as somehow being open to maybe other possibilities or a broader vision of our lives that maybe sometimes, because of circumstances and things,
Yeah.
we have a hard time seeing a bigger picture. We're
That's
so
right.
focused on the one bill, or where am I going to move, or how am I going to
Yeah.
do whatever, that I think somehow putting things in God's hands, it's almost like we're opening ourselves up to more possibilities, and that's how things can become more possible.
And I noticed we're singing that that hymn, Here I Am, God, and I thought, oh, that got me into trouble so many times. But here I am.
Here I am, here I am.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
Well, thank you. Let's give thanks to Joanne. Thank you so much. Is there any spontaneous, last minute, somebody would like to, not put you on the hot seat, but just even say something, is there? No hot seats, but anybody else have something you'd like to share? That's okay, but if, I don't mind closing with this. You know, I think as a sister who is a teacher, she quite profoundly moved by all her students, but I remember one student, she just was saying to me, you know, the letter to her was, you know, Miss B, I may look like I'm really happy on the outside, and I may look like I have it all together, you know, grade 5 saying this, eh? But deep down inside, I have a lot of fears. And if you can get that from a student and to share that with your teacher, or you can share that with one another, or with God especially, that's pretty profound. You know, I'm married to somebody in the medical field, and we were talking about being in control, and I still sometimes hear her come home and say, you know, so-and-so, they run, they exercise, they do, you know, all these things that we're all supposed to do to be, you know, either live longer or have healthier lives, right? And the next thing you know, there's an aneurysm. Next thing you know, they take a heart attack. And all that goes out the window in terms of we think we're so in control, right? Mm-hmm. And the medical community is blown away too at times by life just happens sometimes.
Mm-hmm. I think the gift of this whole conversation really, as I said at the beginning, was we really want to have a chance for each of you to get to know one another better and understand that we are together on this journey of faith. And sometimes it seems hard to admit I'm really having a hard day, or this is really difficult for me. But I hope that each of you will know and feel that the person sitting next to you or behind you or in front of you, we're on this journey together. And in being true to ourselves, we're being true to one another. And the best way we can be there for each other is to really understand what one another's needs are and how we can best hope and being honest about what we can or can't do. But together and with God, all things are possible. And so we hope that you will look to one another for encouragement and support. And I know many of you are already doing that with each other. But just know that you're not alone and that we are brothers and sisters here as a family of faith, and you can rely on that.
Thanks be to God.